I never anticipated that inviting my nephew to stay with me would lead to one of the most extraordinary nights of my life. What transpired that evening still leaves me grappling with questions, and I share this with you because I'm at a loss for how to process it. It all unfolded less than a week ago. Luke, my nephew, was due to arrive in under an hour, and I found myself smoothing the bedspread repeatedly, though it was already pristine. It was a nervous tick I couldn't shake, one that surfaced whenever I was about to host someone. Luke was family, of course, but it had been years since we'd spent meaningful time together. He had always been polite, even reserved, yet endearing in his quiet way. Now at 20, he was a young man, no longer the lanky teenager who had spent weekends with us years ago. It had been nearly 2 years since I'd last seen him, and I realized I wasn't sure what to expect. The knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts. As I opened it, Luke stood there, suitcase in hand, a shy grin spreading across his face. "Hey, Aunt Ellie," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Thanks for having me." "Of course, sweetie," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in, you must be exhausted from the trip." He was taller than I recalled, his shoulders broader, his features more defined. Dark hair fell casually over his forehead, and he brushed it back with an effortless gesture. There was a newfound confidence in his movements, relaxed yet self-assured, that caught me off guard. An inexplicable pang stirred in my chest, though I couldn't quite pinpoint its source. Luke set his bags down in the entryway and glanced around, his eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. "It's been a while," he said with a soft laugh. "I forgot how cozy this place feels." "Cozy?" I teased, raising an eyebrow. "You mean small?" "No," he replied quickly, shaking his head. "I mean it feels like home." His words struck a chord I hadn't anticipated. "Well, I'm glad you think so," I said, my tone softening. "Come on, I'll show you to your room." As I led him down the hallway, I couldn't help but notice how much he had changed. He carried himself with a quiet maturity that hadn't been there before, and there was a warmth in his presence that seemed to fill the space around him. It wasn't just that he had grown up, it was the way he looked at me, his hazel eyes meeting mine with an openness that felt perhaps intimate. "This is you," I said, pushing open the door to the guest room. "I hope it's okay." Luke stepped inside, setting his bags down by the bed. "It's perfect," he said, turning to me with a smile. "Thanks for getting it ready." I lingered in the doorway, unsure why I didn't simply leave him to settle in. "If you need anything, just let me know," I said, my voice quieter now. "I will," he replied, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment too long. I finally retreated to the kitchen, using dinner preparations as an excuse to gather my thoughts. But as I chopped vegetables and stirred the pot on the stove, I couldn't shake the memory of his smile or the way his voice had softened when he said the word home. It was a strange sensation, one that left my chest tight and my mind adrift. Dinner that evening was simple: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine I had opened more for myself than for Luke. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the warm glow of the overhead light casting soft shadows on his face. "This is really good," Luke said, cutting into his chicken. "I don't eat like this at school," I laughed. "What, no home-cooked meals in the dorms? Not unless you count microwaved ramen," he said, grinning. "I'm serious, though, you're a great cook." His compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a blush creep up my neck. "Well, thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's nice to cook for someone who appreciates it." The conversation flowed effortlessly after that, touching on his classes, his part-time job, and the friends he'd made at school. Luke had a way of speaking that made even the mundane sound fascinating, his voice low and warm, with just a hint of humor that kept me smiling. At one point, I noticed he had stopped eating and was watching me, his fork poised midair. "What?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "You just seem happy, it's nice." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I simply smiled and took a sip of wine, hoping he wouldn't notice the slight tremor in my hands. After dinner, Luke insisted on helping me clean up. We stood side by side at the sink, the sound of running water and the clink of dishes filling the comfortable silence. "You don't have to do this," I said, glancing at him as he dried a plate. "You've been taking care of me all night," he replied, his tone light. "Let me return the favor." There was something about the way he said it, the way his voice softened slightly, that made my breath catch. I turned back to the sink, focusing on the soapy water and the feel of the sponge in my hand. But I was acutely aware of him standing so close, the warmth of his presence brushing against me like a whisper. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. "I know I kind of invited myself." "Don't be silly," I replied, turning to face him. "You're always welcome here." Our eyes met, and for a moment the air between us seemed to shift. There was a weight to his gaze, something unspoken but undeniably present. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. "Still," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "It means a lot." His words hung in the air, their sincerity wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension building between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The moment passed, and Luke turned back to the dishes, his movements easy and unhurried. But the memory of his gaze lingered, burning like a brand in the back of my mind. The evening didn't end with the dishes. Luke wandered into the living room, and I followed, feeling an almost magnetic pull toward his presence. He sank onto the couch with an easy familiarity, his long legs stretched out in front of him, and patted the cushion beside him. "Come on, Aunt Ellie," he said with a grin. "Sit down, you've been running around all day." I hesitated for just a moment before taking the seat next to him, feeling the subtle shift in the air as I did. It wasn't the first time we'd sat together on this couch, but tonight felt different. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and the dim light from the floor lamp cast a warm glow over everything. "What do you want to watch?" I asked, reaching for the remote, but Luke took it from my hand with a teasing smile. "Let me choose," he said, scrolling through the options. "I don't trust your taste," I laughed, leaning back against the cushions. "Excuse me, but I have excellent taste. You're the one who used to make me sit through all those terrible action movies." "They weren't terrible," he argued, his tone playful. "They were classics. Classically bad," I shot back, and he chuckled, the sound low and rich, sending a shiver down my spine. Finally, he settled on something, a nature documentary with a soothing narrator and breathtaking shots of wildlife. The kind of thing that could lull you into relaxation, but I found myself hyper-aware of Luke's proximity, the warmth of his arm brushing against mine as we sat side by side. He glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, a small smile playing on his lips. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, tearing my gaze away from him. "Why wouldn't I be? No reason," he replied, his smile widening slightly. "You just seem quiet." I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. "Just tired, I guess." The truth was, my thoughts were a whirlwind. I couldn't stop noticing the way his shoulders filled out his t-shirt, the way his jawline caught the light when he turned his head. It was maddening, this sudden awareness of him, and I chastised myself for letting my mind wander. He was my nephew, for heaven's sake, but Luke didn't seem to notice my inner turmoil. He settled back into the couch, his arm resting casually along the back of it, and I found myself leaning slightly into the space he'd created, drawn to his easy confidence. "This is nice," he said after a while, his voice soft. "I don't get a lot of quiet like this at school. It's always loud, always busy." "I can imagine," I said, glancing at him. "You probably don't get much time to yourself." "Not really," he admitted. "It's why I wanted to come here. I needed a break." "Well, I'm glad you came," I said honestly. "It's been nice having you here." He turned to me then, his hazel eyes meeting mine, and there was something in his expression that made my breath catch. "I've missed this," he said softly, "just being here with you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I could feel the warmth of his gaze, the sincerity in his voice, and it made my chest tighten. "I've missed it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The documentary played on, but I barely registered the scenes of majestic landscapes and wild animals. My attention was fixed on Luke, on the subtle movements he made, the way his hand rested on his thigh, his fingers drumming absently against the fabric of his jeans. At some point, he shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine again, and I felt a jolt of awareness shoot through me. "You're tense," he said suddenly, his voice low and concerned. "Is something bothering you?" "No," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. "Why do you ask?" He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made me squirm. "You just seem distracted, like you're carrying something heavy." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're imagining things, am I?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "Come on, Aunt Ellie, you can talk to me." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. It wasn't that I had anything specific to confess, but the way he looked at me with such openness and care made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm fine, really," I said, forcing a smile, "just tired." He didn't press the issue, but the way he looked at me lingered, his gaze soft but searching. I turned back to the screen, hoping the distraction would ease the tension, but I could feel him watching me, his presence impossible to ignore. As the night stretched on, the documentary ended and the room fell into a comfortable silence. Luke shifted beside me, stretching his arms over his head with a groan. "All right," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "I think I'm gonna head to bed." I nodded, my chest tightening as he stood. "Good night," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Good night, Aunt Ellie," he replied, his smile soft and genuine. "Thanks for tonight, it was nice." As he disappeared down the hallway, I sat there for a long time, the warmth of his presence lingering in the room. My thoughts were a tangled mess, a mix of confusion, longing, and something deeper I couldn't quite name. But the story didn't end there. The hours of the night stretched long and slow. After Luke disappeared down the hallway, I found myself rooted in the same spot on the couch, my thoughts tangled in a web of confusion, longing, and fear. The quiet of the house, once comforting, now felt stifling as my mind replayed every moment of the day. Eventually, I stood, feeling the ache in my legs from sitting too long. The soft hum of the music had faded, leaving the room wrapped in silence. I wandered toward the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would calm the fluttering in my chest. But just as I reached the sink, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. I turned, my breath catching as I saw Luke standing in the doorway. He was barefoot, wearing a loose t-shirt and pajama pants, his hair still slightly damp from his shower. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, stepping into the kitchen. "No, I guess not. What about you?" I glanced down at the glass in my hand. "Same, too much on my mind, I suppose." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. Anything you want to talk about? His question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure how to answer. The weight of the day, the weight of him, hung heavy between us, unspoken but undeniable. I don't know, I admitted, setting the glass down. Sometimes it's hard to put things into words. Luke nodded, his gaze steady and thoughtful. I get that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, filled with the tension that had been simmering between us all day. Finally, he pushed off the counter and took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Aunt Ellie," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my pulse quicken. I want to say something, but I don't want to make things weird." My heart pounded as I looked up at him, his hazel eyes searching mine. "You can say whatever's on your mind, Luke." He hesitated, his jaw tightening as though he was trying to find the right words. "I've been feeling, since I got here, things feel different. You feel different, and I don't know what that means, but it's there." His words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten, the vulnerability in his voice striking a chord deep within me. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I even should, but the pull between us was undeniable. "Luke," I began, my voice trembling, "this is complicated." "I know," he said quickly, stepping closer. "I know it is, but I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend I don't feel something." My breath hitched as he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me that I couldn't ignore. "Luke," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "But tell me you don't feel it too." His words stopped me cold, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The truth was there, staring me in the face, and I couldn't deny it any longer. "I do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But that doesn't mean I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly, his hazel eyes earnest. "I just needed you to know." The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me, and before I could think, I reached out, placing my hand on his arm. Skin was warm beneath my touch, and I felt him tense before relaxing under my fingers. "Luke," I said softly, my voice steady now. Whatever this is, it's not something we can rush into. We have to be careful." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I promised, my hand tightening on his arm. "But we have to take things slow. We have to think this through." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "Okay. Slow, I can do that." For a moment we stood there, the silence between us heavy but no longer suffocating. There was a sense of understanding now, a quiet agreement that, while the road ahead would be difficult, we would face it together. Finally, I stepped back, releasing his arm. "We should get some sleep," I said softly, my voice steady but my heart racing. He nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. "Good night, Aunt Ellie." "Good night, Luke," I replied, watching as he turned and disappeared down the hallway. As I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, my thoughts drifted back to the events of the day. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time I felt a sense of clarity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together, one step at a time. The next morning, the air in the house was filled with a quiet tension that wasn't uncomfortable but was undeniably different. I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, and found myself staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anticipation. The memory of Luke's words, the vulnerability in his voice, lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. I dressed quickly, opting for a light sweater and jeans, and headed to the kitchen, the familiar clatter of coffee cups grounding me in the routine. Luke was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug in hand, his expression thoughtful. "Morning," I said softly, my voice breaking the stillness. He looked up, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Morning." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. Finally, I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter opposite him, the warm ceramic grounding me as I searched for the right thing to say. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, my voice casual but tinged with hesitation. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in his cup. "Not really, too much on my mind." I nodded, understanding all too well. "Me too." The words hung in the air, and I could feel his eyes on me, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. Finally, he set his mug down and crossed his arms, his expression serious. "Ellie," he began, his voice steady but soft. "About last night, I know," I interrupted, gently meeting his gaze. "We need to talk." He nodded, his expression tense but hopeful. I need to know where we stand. I don't want to make things harder for you or for me, but I can't ignore this." I took a deep breath, setting my own mug down as I searched for the right words. "Luke, this is new for both of us. It's confusing and complicated, but we can't let it spiral out of control. I don't want to make things worse," he said quickly, his voice earnest. "But I also don't want to pretend this isn't happening." "Neither do I," I admitted, my voice soft but firm. "But we have to be careful, we have to take things slow, and we have to be honest with each other." He nodded, his hazel eyes steady and filled with determination. "I can do that. I want to figure this out with you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my chest tighten with a mix of fear and longing. The path ahead was uncharted, but the sincerity in his voice gave me hope that we could navigate it together. "We will," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within me. "But it's going to take time." Luke smiled, a small but genuine expression that made my heart ache. "Time I can handle." For the rest of the morning, we moved through the house with a new sense of understanding, the tension between us shifting into something quieter but no less powerful. We didn't speak of last night again, but the weight of it lingered in every glance, every shared smile, every unspoken word. By the afternoon, the sun had warmed the house, and I found myself in the living room sorting through old photo albums. Luke wandered in, his curiosity piqued as he sat beside me on the couch. "What are you looking at?" he asked, leaning over to catch a glimpse of the pictures. "Just some old memories," I replied, flipping the page to reveal a photo of my family at the beach. "These were simpler times." He smiled, his expression soft as he studied the photo. "You look happy." I admitted, my voice tinged with nostalgia. "But life changes, doesn't it?" He nodded, his gaze lingering on the photo before turning to me. "It does, but that doesn't mean we can't find happiness again." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. There was something about Luke's presence, his quiet confidence and unwavering sincerity, that made me believe him. And as the afternoon stretched into evening, we continued to talk, the conversation flowing easily between us. We laughed over shared stories, reminisced about simpler times, and slowly began to rebuild the bond that had always been there, now stronger than ever. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm golden glow, I realized how much lighter I felt. The weight of uncertainty and fear had lifted, replaced by a quiet hope that together we could face whatever came next. And as Luke stood to leave the room, his hand brushed against mine, the touch lingering just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. He glanced back at me, his hazel eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, and smiled. "Good night, Ellie," he said softly, his voice steady but warm. "Good night, Luke," I replied, watching as he disappeared down the hallway. As I sat alone in the quiet living room, my thoughts drifted back to the events of the day. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time I felt a sense of clarity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together, one step at a time. The day Luke was set to leave came faster than I expected, though the tension in the air had been a constant reminder. The house felt quieter than usual that morning, as if it knew that his presence was about to be gone. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot as it brewed, trying to ignore the ache in my chest. Luke appeared in the doorway, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed the same mixture of emotions that I felt. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "Coffee?" he nodded, setting his bag down by the door and taking a seat at the table. I poured 2 mugs, setting one in front of him before taking a seat across from him. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable, as if we were both bracing for what was to come. "So," I began, wrapping my hands around the mug. "Everything packed?" "Yeah," he said, nodding. "I triple-checked this morning, don't want to forget anything." I chuckled softly, though the sound felt hollow. "That's a first. You used to forget half your things every time you left somewhere." He smiled, the warmth in his expression both comforting and bittersweet. "Guess I'm finally growing up." For a moment, we both laughed, the sound filling the space between us. But as the laughter faded, the weight of his departure settled over us once more. "Ellie," he said after a long pause, his voice steady but hesitant, "I just want to say thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my voice soft but firm. "You've been here for me just as much as I've been here for you." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his mug. "Still, I don't know what I would have done without you." "You don't have to do it alone," I said, my words carrying more weight than I intended. "You know that, right? Wherever you go, whatever happens, I'm here." His eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought I saw them glisten. "I know," he said quietly. "That means more than you'll ever know." The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking the hour, and we both knew it was time. Luke stood, grabbing his bag and slinging it over his shoulder. I followed him to the door, my heart pounding with every step. As he turned to face me, the sunlight streaming through the window illuminated his face, making his hazel eyes seem even brighter. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I'll come back," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I promise." "I know," I replied, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," he said softly. And then, before I could think twice, he pulled me into a hug. His arms wrapped around me tightly, and I felt the warmth of his embrace seep into every part of me. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment, knowing it would be the last for a while. When he finally pulled away, his hand lingered on my arm for a moment before he stepped back, his expression both sad and determined. He picked up his bag, opened the door, and walked out, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. I stood in the doorway, watching as he disappeared down the street, the ache in my chest growing with every step he took. But even as the tears threatened to fall, I felt a strange sense of peace. Luke wasn't gone forever, and I knew in my heart that this wasn't the end of our story. As I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, I let out a shaky breath. The house felt emptier without him, but it was also filled with the echoes of the time we'd shared, the laughter, the quiet moments, and everything in between. And as I stood there in the quiet, I realized something important. Luke had left, but the bond we'd built would remain, stronger than ever, no matter how far apart we were. Still, to this day, I don't know what to think about all of this. I don't know if I'm in love or if I'm acting out of some other, deeper need. I need someone's perspective, and that's why I've shared this story with you. What do you think? Let me know. Thank you.